My head is already spinning. I think it's 20 years since last time I was in a conference context where French was spoken. And I felt like I spent so much energy following Anastasia's wonderful talk that my head right now is still running around a bit. Anyways, hermeneutics. So I teach in the US, but as you will hear from my accent, I'm from not exactly this part of the world, but at least this continent. I'm from Norway. Oslo, Norway is where I'm from. So I have worked for a long time in hermeneutics, and especially on Gadamer, Hans-Georg Gadamer, and 19th century theories of interpretation. But over the past 8 years or so, I have been doing some work with my colleague at the University of Sydney, Dalia Nazar, to uncover the works of women philosophers in this period. And one of the things that happened during this work of uncovering the lost jewels, as it were, of tradition, is that I did, of course, start thinking about what resources we have as hermeneuticians to think about not only how the great works of the canon can be kept alive, but also to think critically about all the works that have been left out of the canon and could perhaps have deserved a place in the canon. So, with the works, the philosophical works, the works of women philosophers, I think the tradition has basically told us that they didn't exist at all and that there was no point looking for them. But what Dalia and I found during our work was that women did produce great works of philosophy, and that there are every good reason to go look for them. So what I've come to think is that we need hermeneutic models that can help us incorporate new narratives in the history of philosophy. And we need hermeneutic models that allow us to reflect on why we have not done so before, why we have allowed ourselves in philosophy to be limited by a canon of great works written by male philosophers only. Now, I wish I could present some work of one of these women philosophers here today, but that's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about Friedrich Schleiermacher and what I think is Schleiermacher's misunderstood and very, very potent and promising theory of hermeneutic contribution. And I hope it will be clear how Schleiermacher, in my view, offers a critical hermeneutics that can help us think about tradition in what I think take to be less, I don't know, conservative is not exactly the word I'm looking for, but it covers vaguely what I'm looking for. So less conservative models than what Hans-Georg Gadamer can offer to us. So my presentation today explores a lineage in 18th and early 19th century philosophy that makes productive, in my view, political use of the idea that the interpreter should aspire to objectivity through adequate contextual reconstruction. Among the philosophers I have in mind are Johann Gottfried Herder, Friedrich Schleiermacher, and Hermeneutics Gjesdal. By acknowledging the cultural situatedness not only of the symbolic expression, the text, the artwork, or otherwise, but also of the interpreter, these philosophers argue that hermeneutics allows for a better understanding of the other, but also affords an opportunity to reflect on the beliefs, prejudices, and preconceived notions that color the outlook of the interpreter, and whoever strives to establish or maintain the hegemony of a particular canon or tradition. In their views, hermeneutics and political philosophy, interpretation, and if you like, emancipation, should be co-thought. Discussions of objectivity in interpretation are connected with a critique of Eurocentrism, especially in Herder and Gjesdal, colonialism, especially in Herder and Schleiermacher, slavery, especially in Herder and Gjesdal, and misogyny, especially in Schleiermacher and Gjesdal again. In my presentation today, I will focus on Schleiermacher's work. I will use his work as a lens to highlight what I think is important in this lineage, and I will focus on the connection between, on the one hand, a commitment to methodological understanding, and on the other, an orientation towards the larger political relevance of hermeneutic practice. The practice, one could say, that we're engaged in when we're seeking to acquire or gain Bildung. In particular, I'm interested in how Schleiermacher's hermeneutic orientation goes hand in hand with his emancipatory commitments. I ask, do the commitment to historical cultural objectivity and interpretation on the one hand, and the emancipatory Enlightenment ideals on the other, simply emerge at the same time in his work and in the history of hermeneutics, or is there an intrinsic relationship between the two? Surveying some key hermeneutic works, my preliminary conclusion is that in this branch of late 18th and early 19th century hermeneutics, interpretation and emancipation are closely related, but do not completely overlap. So first, a clarification of terms. For the purpose of this talk, I do not distinguish, as some people will do, and as I do in other contexts, between hermeneutics and philosophy of interpretation. When discussing hermeneutic works and practice, I generally refer to the process of interpretation. I hope it will be clear from the context when I discuss a wider notion of hermeneutics, such as we find it in Gadamer's work, for example. So my talk is organized through three parts. I will first offer what I think is a fairly neutral overview of Schleiermacher's hermeneutic contribution. Then I will briefly survey what I think is the standard reception of Schleiermacher's hermeneutics, and then I will offer, by contextualizing Schleiermacher's hermeneutics, I will offer what I take to be an alternative approach to his work that can give us some good resources to work with today, in my view, as contemporary hermeneuticians, as scholars who are interested in the challenges and practice of Bildung. So for Schleiermacher, the field of hermeneutics is universal. All language use, even all symbolic expression, is in theory subject to interpretation. And vice versa, no symbolic expression is so constituted that it escapes the field of interpretation. Hermeneutics, in his work, is defined as the art of understanding, particularly, but not only, the written discourse of another person correctly. 2 points are critical here. Schleiermacher's emphasis on another person, rather than simply a tradition, a culture, or a text, and his emphasis on epistemic norms. We can, in his view, philosophically and non-trivially identify more productive and less productive hermeneutic approaches. Schleiermacher distinguishes between a lax praxis that suffices for most of our everyday interactions, and a strict and consciously adopted practice, on the other hand. His hermeneutic lectures, given in Halle and Berlin between 1805 and 1833, contribute to the strict practice. In addition to his discussions of scholarly interpretation, his lectures reference colloquial interaction and challenges in everyday understanding. So he can, on the one hand, discuss how we should best interpret passages in the Bible, for example. On the other hand, he will discuss how we deal with a neighbor's simple comment about the weather. If our neighbor is saying, for example, the weather is nice today, we might wonder if her statement conveyed friendliness, a meteorological observation, both, or maybe something entirely different. The lectures are given in a critical spirit. They provide a set of methodological tools, standards against which the adequacy or correctness of our interpretive practices, be they strict or lax, can be measured. In laying out his views on interpretation, Schleiermacher focuses on the structure of language and on how an understanding of this structure and of poetical, rhetorical, stylistic devices, as well as historical and context-sensitive work, helps the critical interpreter approximate the meaning of the text. Schleiermacher famously draws a distinction between grammatical interpretation on the one hand and what he calls psychological or technical interpretation on the other. The former is seen as the higher when one looks at language to the extent to which it determines the thought of all individuals. The latter, the technical interpretation, is seen as higher when one regards language as the means whereby the individual communicates his thoughts. So the first is language-oriented, the second is oriented towards the individual. Whereas grammatical interpretation seeks an understanding of the linguistic resources shared between an author and her community, technical interpretation aims to grasp the particular style of a text. The techne requires more than mechanical applications of rules. Moreover, Schleiermacher offers reflections on how, in encountering different kinds of text, an interpreter needs to balance the relationship between these two approaches. The degree to which an expression is individualized varies with culture, genre, ambition, and the mindset of an author. In order to reach a proper understanding of a text, Schleiermacher recommends a back and forth between a historical and what he calls a divinatory approach. The first proceeds by way of identifying differences and similarities with other texts or passages in a given text. The second, by way of a more intuitive grasp of the expression as a stylistic, expressive unity. Schleiermacher does not think that his methodology can per se guarantee a correct interpretation. Any method will need to be applied, and application by definition carries with it a risk of contingency. Yet a methodological awareness can help guide our efforts to avoid misunderstanding. Misunderstanding, in turn, is, and again I quote, either a consequence of hastiness or of bias. Of the two, Schleiermacher says, bias is the most pressing problem. In interpreting the symbolic utterances of another, we gravitate towards ascribing to the utterance a meaning that is close to our own beliefs and our own ideas, and we often overlook how the expression of another can challenge our own thinking. For Schleiermacher, this is the tendency that the stricter hermeneutic practice is designed to help us overcome. Since bias can be implicit and will typically not be recognized, the strict hermeneutic practice assumes that misunderstanding can happen in every hermeneutic encounter. And this point sets Schleiermacher apart from the main currents in 20th century hermeneutics. So I want to say a little bit about the reception of Schleiermacher's hermeneutics over the past 50 years or so. And the most famous reception, and the most critical reception too, is Hans-Georg Gadamer's Truth and Method. Here, Gadamer basically develops his own point of view through a very intense, strong criticism of Schleiermacher and what he takes to be Schleiermacher's quasi-objectivist methodological strand of hermeneutics. Gadamer sees this, moreover, as the result of an undue focus on individuality and subjective expression. Now, shortly after, or a while after Gadamer had published Truth and Method, Peter Zonde reacts to this reading and emphasizes the value of Schleiermacher's orientation towards individual language use. Zonde sees Schleiermacher as a proto-modernist alternative to Gadamer's emphasis on the continuity of tradition. And Zonde wrote an essay on Schleiermacher that he did in fact dedicate to the poet Paul Celan. Gadamer's student Heinz Kimmler, in turn, suggests a reorganization of Schleiermacher's lectures, designed to show that Schleiermacher, just like Gadamer, first emphasized the commonality of language, but later drifted towards a different position where we find precisely the blend of subjectivism and positivism that Gadamer criticizes. More in line with Zonde, Manfred Frank emphasizes how romantic hermeneutics responds to the notion of an individual universal, thus offering a middle point between ontological hermeneutics and structuralism. And more recently, Andrew Bowie has argued that Schleiermacher's linguistic analysis anticipates later Anglophone philosophy of language. So the problem, in my view, with all of these approaches to Schleiermacher is that they isolate his hermeneutic work from the rest of his work in the period when he is doing and thinking about hermeneutics. So I want to suggest that we see Schleiermacher's hermeneutics in the context of his larger work, and that's what I'm going to do in the rest of my presentation. So the Gadamer-Zonde-Frank reception has generated a renewed interest in romantic hermeneutics. But these approaches have largely overlooked Schleiermacher's important reference to bias, that is, the political and philosophical motivation that the young Schleiermacher's turn to hermeneutics shares with, for example, Herder. In order fully to see the significance of this point, it is helpful to situate Schleiermacher's contribution in the context of his philosophical work in the years leading up to the hermeneutics lectures. Largely clustered around the end of the century and the publication of his seminal Speeches on Religion from 1799, we find Schleiermacher's review of Kant's Anthropology, also from 1799. We find his unfinished essay on the descriptions of the colonies in New Holland, so Australia, from the same period, and we find his so-called Catechism for Women, which he published in the Athenaeum in 1799. So 1799 is a key year, no doubt about it. Schleiermacher's first philosophical work, major philosophical work, Speeches on Religion, takes to task the despisers of religion, people who don't like religion. The target of its criticism is contemporary intellectuals who, on the basis of their petrified interpretations of text and practices, reject religion without really taking care to understand it. They base their conclusions on common but uninspected assumptions about religion, i.e. on prejudice and bias. These biases, though, are not completely unfounded. For according to Schleiermacher, a combination of stifling Bible scholarship and the cementing of truisms and dogma in and through tradition has led us to forget the living experiential core of religion and left us merely with dead letters. Seeking to repair this situation, he argues for a broad, possibly even pantheist notion in which faith takes at its basis the experience of a oneness with the universe. The universe in turn, or nature, is seen as a totality that gets expressed in and through myriad individual parts, including but not limited to individual human beings. Independently of any particular religion, Schleiermacher offers a phenomenology of religious feeling as the core of religion as such. The living core of religion rests with an awe in existence. It is this experience that an interpreter of religious texts should seek to retrieve, independently of the doctrines cemented in the canon or the tradition. On this model, tradition is not only a hermeneutic enabler, but it can also, and this is the important point, limit our understanding. Hermeneutic transmission, the tradition, can also limit our understanding of a given text or practice. Tradition can open up a text to us, but it can also limit it. With his emphasis on the diversity of human expressions, and his opposing this view to the notion of a universal reason, it should not surprise that Schleiermacher's early work extends to the field of anthropology, i.e. the discussion of cultural others. His review of Kant's Anthropology is an important contribution whose relevance has been overlooked in Schleiermacher's scholarship. In his review, Schleiermacher is critical of how Kant allows his anthropological observations to be guided by an a priori conception of the human mind. This, he indicates, leaves Kant rather poorly equipped to grasp empirical cultural differences and to understand his own ethical and epistemic status as a culturally situated interpreter. In short, a Kantian position leaves people, in Schleiermacher's polemical formulation, poor knowers of themselves. As a consequence, Schleiermacher rhetorically argues, Kant's study is indeed excellent, but not as an anthropology, but as a negation of anthropology. Whoever thinks contemporary reviewers can be vicious should read this article of Schleiermacher. He's very, very polemical. As Schleiermacher concludes his review, he draws attention to the randomness of Kant's descriptions and to the areas in which they most strikingly occur, namely his understanding of art, his negative descriptions of women, and his aestheticizing of non-Western peoples. He highlights Kant's, here again I quote, Kant's complete lack of knowledge of art, and especially of poetry. He highlights Kant's treatment of the female as a deviation of the male, als eine Arbeit, and he highlights Kant's description of other peoples, which smacks, as Schleiermacher puts it, too much of the joys at the table. For Schleiermacher, Kant's anthropology is not so much an attempt to understand others as it is an opportunity to use his own theory of the self as a norm, legitimized a priori, and so assumed to be universally valid, against which other forms of life are assessed. In conclusion, Schleiermacher continues, this is but a kantology, that can only be recommended highly to the blind admirers of this great man. In the years leading up to his hermeneutic lectures, Schleiermacher himself addresses some of the area in which Kant, if we follow his review, falls short: anthropological understanding and Kant's discussion of the situation or status of women. So first, anthropological understanding. So between 1799 and 1802, Schleiermacher works on a substantial review of ethnological anthropological approaches to the colonists in so-called New Holland or New Wales, Australia. Schleiermacher had not set foot in Australia, nor for that matter had Kant traveled far beyond Königsberg. However, Schleiermacher's notes do not attempt to survey life in the Dutch and English colonies as such. Instead, they comprise a critical discussion of the European descriptions of the inhabitants of this part of the world and life in the colonies. In the Gesamtausgabe, these notes are classified as part of Schleiermacher's literary attempt, not as part of his philosophy. When read alongside his hermeneutics and his criticism of Kant's anthropology, however, it is clear that this is not a poetic project, but that Schleiermacher here investigates various ways of approaching others, i.e. he addresses key hermeneutic topics. While Schleiermacher's review stays relatively close to the studies presented and often offer little more than brief summaries, it also contains important methodological evaluative passages. For example, Schleiermacher worries that the Europeans will not understand others if they assume a cultural hierarchy in which the described people are placed at the very bottom and the Europeans at the very top. Moreover, he points out how tolerance, if not accompanied by mutual respect, often camouflage pragmatic and exploitative interests. He emphasizes how the colonial spirit is one in which the European settlers approach others instrumentally and not in terms of a shared humanity. That is, they focus on how the native inhabitants can be used. So that's a little taster of Schleiermacher's approach to anthropological issues. But as far as Schleiermacher's approach to women goes, his 1799 Catechism of Reason for Noble Ladies stand out. The Catechism was published as fragment number 364 of the Athenaeum, and would later earn him praise from prominent 19th century feminists such as Hedwig Dohm. Drawing on the educational form of the Catechism, Schleiermacher advocates friendship between men and women. That's his first commandment. He insists that women should not have to compromise their feelings in order to please men. That's his third commandment. That they should not be complicit in the barbarity of men in word and deed, his ninth commandment. And that they should seek education, his 10th commandment. In addition to these commandments, Schleiermacher presents 3 credos, the first of which reads, "I believe in immortal humanity, which was before it assumed the garment of masculinity and femininity." So humanity is prior to gender. Schleiermacher's catechism thus directly responds to Kant's claim that women are a deviation and abart of men. This indeed was a hotly debated issue at the time. Only a few years earlier, Theodor Gottlieb von Hippel, Kant's acquaintance, a writer, a philosopher, and the mayor of Königsberg, had published his treatise on improving the status of women, and Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman was translated into German. Schleiermacher owned a copy of the former in his library. Moreover, Schleiermacher's catechism directly tackles Fichte's claim, plausibly a response to Hippel's more progressive view, that once a woman is married to a man, the husband is the administrator of all her rights. She will, as Fichte puts it, her rights to be asserted and exercised only insofar as he, her husband, wills them to be. That's Fichte. So like Kant, Fichte also denies that women can pursue science, philosophy, and universal arguments, and claims that women's writings should be limited to special women's literature. So Schleiermacher, in his early work, argues against all of these points, and thus breaks, in effect, the lineage of misogyny we find from Kant via Fichte, Hegel, and Schopenhauer to Nietzsche. Schleiermacher's anthropological notes and his catechism connects directly, in my view, with his hermeneutic focus on misunderstanding. The assumption, contra Gadamer's more well-known position, that misunderstanding is the default risk to be kept in view. In his early writing on anthropology and gender, Schleiermacher discusses the hermeneutic challenge that is often overlooked, namely situations in which there simply is no effort to understand the other at all. What bars the effort to understand is, by Schleiermacher's lights, a false image of sovereignty, a systematic mixing up of cultural differences and gender with hierarchies of value. The question then is how this predicament can be overcome. Schleiermacher never finished his work on New Holland, which we can imagine would have sought to exemplify a more promising intercultural exchange. When it comes to gender, however, the young Schleiermacher does offer more to go by. He discusses the kind of intersubjective conduct and interaction, the kind of recognition that facilitates understanding, for example, in his essay on the theory of social behavior, another work from 1799. In Essay on a Theory of Social Behavior, Schleiermacher develops the notion of sociality that exists in between the private sphere of the family and the legal domain of the state, that of the romantic salon. He defends the idea that of women as persons, as potential thous, that should be understood and taken seriously in and through hermeneutic encounters. Indeed, his notion is stronger than that, suggesting that a mixing of gender leads to more successful social patterns for everyone. In my view, these texts from the late 1790s, the analysis of the fundamental lack of a will to understand, and of the context that facilitate understanding, provide a philosophical framework against which Schleiermacher's hermeneutics lectures should be understood. His emphasis in the lectures on the universality of misunderstanding, and his focus even earlier on intersubjective contexts that are deprived of hermeneutic openness, makes it imperative for him to explore social forms that stimulate a will to understand. He addresses, in other words, not only the criteria for a critical methodological understanding, but also the interpersonal ethical commitment to understanding and the social conditions under which such a commitment can be realized. With its free speech, its Wechselwirkung between expressivity and receptivity, and interaction between men and women, the informal culture of the salon, he argues, offers one such example. From this contextualizing reading of Schleiermacher's theory of interpretation, we can glean a number of points. First, Schleiermacher is aware, even indeed makes it an entirely central premise for his thinking about past and culturally distant expressions and our access to them. The tradition, this is the important point, tradition not only discloses these expressions, but also provides us with patterns of understanding that might be misleading, deceptive, and even systematically tainted by ideology. Second, and following from the above, hermeneutics is a matter of overcoming misunderstanding, including such misunderstandings as described above. Third, the hermeneutic focus on individuality is not simply a testimony to an aestheticizing, as Gadamer claims, or modernist, as Zonde claims, sensitivity to style, but it's related to a cultural sensitive thinking about who this thou might turn out to be, and a demand that we seek to understand the thou, another individual, independently of pre-existing hierarchies of gender, culture, and skin color. Fourth, Schleiermacher emphasizes that the goal of hermeneutic is the correct understanding of the writing, speech, and expression of another human being, culturally and temporally close or distant. Fifth, as opposed to a lax everyday interaction, reflective or critical hermeneutic efforts proceeds self-critically and by reference to a methodological awareness. And sixth, Schleiermacher recognizes that even such a methodological hermeneutics can only make sense if there is, in the first place, a will to understand and to recognize the other as being worthy of understanding. So after Schleiermacher, or before Schleiermacher, around the same time period, both Gjesdal and Gjesdal built on and further developed this kind of thinking. But in Stahl's case, she leaves behind a focus on the hermeneutic methodology, a standard of validity and interpretation, and centers instead on prejudices and internalized bias, and the particularly not the hermeneutic situation, they and gender. So I want to conclude by addressing some possible concerns relating to my account of Schleiermacher. First, in emphasizing the emancipatory or even straight out political aspects of Schleiermacher's hermeneutics, by connecting his views on interpretation to his views on issues such as imperialism and gender, it can seem as if I bring the philosopher too close to our own age and our own concerns. Following Schleiermacher's own hermeneutic insights, it would be naive to pretend that this fallacy is not an ever-present risk in interpretation. However, while recognizing this risk, I have tried to stick closely to the relevant textual evidence and show how hermeneutic and emancipatory discourses are intertwined, albeit not identical in his work. Further, I think the question can be reversed. That is, although the concerns at stake in Schleiermacher's larger work are indeed of interest to us today, it is not obvious that it is tendentious to pay attention to their treatments in late 18th and early 19th century philosophers. It might as well be that the problem is not the effort to provide a contextualizing reading, but the previous lack of attention to the wider context of hermeneutic discourse in the Enlightenment and beyond. From this point of view, the question is not simply, is it presentist to focus on the emancipatory aspects of Schleiermacher's hermeneutic contributions? Instead, we need to ask, why is it that these aspects of his hermeneutics have been systematically overlooked in the reception, Gadamer included? This, in my view, is a question that probably cannot be answered without taking into account the potentially conservative implications of 20th century hermeneutics. Its tendency, as exemplified by Gadamer, to normatively focus on the need to keep alive the great works of the past. Should we not also ask for voices that have been marginalized and make the shift from the tradition in the singular to the more messy, but also hermeneutically more intriguing, traditions in the plural? And moreover, would it not be plausible to assume that hermeneuticians participating in discussions of imperialism, women's right to recognition of education, for example, would indeed raise the question to what extent our relationship to other cultures and individuals does have a hermeneutic dimension. And vice versa, that they would ask how hermeneutics can exceed the discussion of the right approaches to the existing canon, and also ask what works have possibly been overlooked by or marginalized by this very canon itself. My point in this presentation has not been to lift Schleiermacher's work out of its historical context, nor to brush over his shortcomings. And there are many shortcomings, especially in his later works, in my view. Instead, I have wanted to explore his contributions to carving out a systematic hermeneutic space, one that, in my view, has been overlooked both in the reception of Schleiermacher's work and in the systematic articulation of 20th century hermeneutics. It is up to us, I think, if we want to keep the hermeneutic tradition alive, to take the potentials of this hermeneutic model in and develop more and even challenging hermeneutic positions